Good morning, everybody, and from sunny Ireland, and welcome to this joint webinar between the European Movement Ireland, European Commission representation in Ireland, and Eurofound, the Foundation for the Improvement of Working and Living Conditions in Europe, located here in Ireland. This event is taken as a part of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and it's titled Equality and Inclusion in Post-Pandemic EU. So my name is Jepsen, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. So we've chosen this subject, equality and inclusion in the post-pandemic EU, as it's set against the background of Europe embarking on its path to rebuild a greener, more digital and more resilient Europe in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. So the focus of today is to look at whether we are actually observing growing or emerging inequalities in our societies as we're heading towards a recovery, and discuss what needs to happen to tackle them in order to ensure that we are actually creating a more equal and inclusive society as we move forward. So our panelists we have today, which I will be introducing in a few seconds, will highlight how COVID has hit different parts of society in different ways and bring to the fore what the implications could be in the medium to long run. We will engage with some of the steps that could be taken in order to ensure that some of the challenges and inequalities that have arisen as a result of the COVID could be managed and contained. So to get our discussion going, and what we want to do today is to have a discussion with you, the audience. We will let our panelists provide an introduction to the matter of today, just to set the scene and provide some food for thought. We'll set out what we're observing, what it actually means, and in particular, what actions are planned to take or do we need to take in order to deal with these challenges. But most importantly is like once we've had this introduction, it would be followed by a panel discussion. The panel discussion should be based on the questions that you, the audience, will provide during the introductory talks. So there are different ways of providing the questions. So the first one is that you can send it by email to events@europeanmovement.ie or via social media using the hashtags "The Future is Yours" or NextGenEU. So these ways of communicating with us will be bannered up during the introductory talks. And we would much appreciate if you can log your questions, your comments, your suggestions, so that we can use them in our discussion after the introductory talks. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists, because I'm really, really happy with the panelists that we have today. And I think that can provide a lot of food for thought and would be very good to engage in a discussion with. So the first speaker is Massimiliano Mascherini. So Massi is head of unit here at Eurofound in social policies. And before coming to Eurofound, Massi worked at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. His latest work has concentrated around youth, around the socioeconomic convergence in the European Union. And Massi also has headed up the team that has been surveying the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on work and life across the European member states since last year, since April 2020. So after Massi, Shana Cohen will set out how the COVID crisis have in particular affected vulnerable groups here in Ireland. Shana is currently the director of TASC. But before coming to TASC, she taught at Georgetown University, the University of Sheffield, and University of Cambridge, and was also the deputy director of the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. So Shana's work has mostly concentrated on how social and economic policies have influenced political and social identity. So two introductory talks about who has been particularly affected and how have they been affected by the COVID crisis and what does this mean for us moving forward. So after these introductory talks, we have very glad to welcome Carla Pereira, who's a cabinet expert and employment and social advisor for Commissioner Schmit at the European Commission. And Carla will set out how the EU is engaging with the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis what the challenges are, and how the EU is planning to engage with some of these challenges and opportunities as well. So Carla, before joining the cabinet of Commissioner Schmit, was the head of unit of Directorate General in Employment and Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission, dealing with skills qualification and later on from social protection. So as you can see, we have three experts on the panel to get us started in our discussion. So with this few introductory remarks, I would like, Massi, please, could you start and let us know a little bit about what have we seen in the EU. And to the audience, please let us get your questions via the two ways, social media or via the email, please. Massi, please.
Thanks a lot, Maria. And yes, well, let's start with thinking what is the COVID crisis, actually? The crisis that started in March 2020 quickly developed in an economic and social crisis, actually going beyond the health crisis as a result of the restrictive measures that were put in place in order to control the virus. So if you wanted to use the Greek mythology, we can think that the COVID crisis is like a modern Kerberos, the three-headed hound, guardian of the head of the three mythology that have three heads. And so actually this is the COVID. It has the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the social crisis. And all these three heads actually are affecting and biasing a different part of the population. Now, in history, previous pandemics like the Black Death or the Spanish flu are always seen like great levelers, great equalizers, actually. This because they were extremely fatal. And as a result of this mass death, the workforce was reduced and then wages actually were going up. So it were reducing inequalities. But COVID is far from this. Luckily, the fatality is much smaller and is far also for being a great equalizer, actually. And on the other hand, it has exacerbated inequalities among the various groups of the societies. Older people were more affected by health crisis, whereas younger cohorts were more affected by economic and social crisis, actually. So it has exacerbated multidimensional inequalities, differences between high earners and the most vulnerable, women and men, young people, inequalities in employment, and so on. So in my introductory speech, I will basically overview quickly these inequalities that emerge from the COVID crisis. First of all, the pandemic hit and affected differently low-paid workers that often are less educated against high-paid workers, actually often more educated. This because lower-paid workers are overrepresented in the sectors like hospitality, like travels, retails, that were more affected by the COVID pandemic. So they were more likely to have lost their job and then rely on benefits as a result of the COVID crisis. And also for this reason, actually, these type of workers are less likely to have telework during the pandemic. So in some sense, they were also more exposed to the health effect of the crisis. One result of this could be the rise of income inequalities. Now, in terms of income inequalities, there are not yet comparable data to have an European pictures. But actually, first studies on income inequalities shown that thanks to the support measure and to the strong national and European policy response, the rise and the surge of income inequalities is more reduced, as it should have been following the job loss of the low-income workers if no support were there. There is an recent study from Sweden that found that, for example, income inequalities increased, not enormously actually in Sweden during the COVID, thanks to the government support. And actually, without the government support in mitigating the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis, the increase of income inequalities would have been 2 to 3 times higher than it has been. So there is an important role of mitigation in the government and European support to citizens in having smoothed and limited income inequalities. Then there is also a question of wealth inequalities, actually. And here, situation is different, because if we think about additional wealth that might be accumulated during the COVID-19, actually, what we saw what we can imagine through educated guess, given the lack of data, is that the gap between the wealthier and higher earners part of the population and the most vulnerable has increased. The reason of this is that we know that during the first month of the pandemic, actually, with the lockdown, closure of shops, basically consumptions collapsed. Spending dropped overall Europe, and on average, there is some report indicating that the spending decrease of 50-60% in countries like Germany, Italy, and France, and then as a result of this drop in spending, saved increase, actually. But of course, the saving capacity of individuals varies on the basis of their income. So high earner households, actually, that are those who actually have a higher share of expenditure, had more savings in comparison to the lower paid household that have a lower expenditure capacity, but as well as a lower saving capacity, and as a result of the crisis, that were more relying on benefit. So this difference, this gap on additional wealth that was accumulated during the pandemic probably increased during the result of the pandemic. Then another inequality that was exacerbated is the gender inequality. Here we know that in terms of employment, while the first data were indicating that women were more vulnerable in comparison of men in terms of participation to the labor market, then with the months passing, it has data shown that in terms of employment, there has not been a difference in the impact. So it's not really a she session as it was defined at the beginning. However, the situation is much more complex. With the telework, that saved a lot of jobs, actually, but has implication on work-life balance, especially with the closure of schools. Actually, the work-life conflicts of many families with young children exploded. And these actually on the shoulder on women, actually, because basically the uneven distribution of family responsibilities among men and women in families is still far from being equal, and so the impact was much stronger on women that had actually to take care of children during the closure of schools, as well as all the related activities, and then working. So if we look at the indicators measuring work-life balance, especially in those that indicate family as a possible obstacle for work, we saw that women were much more vulnerable. In fact, 29% of women found hard to concentrate to job because of family, against the 11% of men. And actually, only 7% of men found that family was a kind of an obstacle to their work, against the 26% of women, 4 times larger. So this is an incredible number that actually shown that women were bearing the brunt of the crisis due to this accumulation of responsibilities and to the uneven distribution of family responsibilities. Then again, briefly, and to conclude, young people. Young people has been hit very hard by by the COVID crisis. We know that young people were the victim of the 2008 to 2013 recession. And the big question was, is the story going to repeat itself, actually? And unfortunately, there are indications that this may be the case, but in a more complex way. So in terms of employment, what we have seen has been an increased of unemployment among young people higher than for the rest of the population. This was due actually because young people are working in sectors that were more affected by the crisis and in contracts that are more vulnerable. Then the big impact was on mental health. Usually young people shown mental well-being indicators much higher than the rest of the population. With the COVID, the situation was reversed. As a result of lockdown measures and non-pharmaceutical interventions in order to control the virus, young people were hit very, very hard in terms of mental health, reporting level of depression, loneliness, and tensions much higher than the rest of the population. Finally, education. We know that with the closure of schools, education went online, and this allow actually to continue education, but with several implications. First of all, in scientific literature, is clear that school attendance is related with a higher performance and a higher accumulation of human capital. And then in terms, again, on inequalities. Education online show again the exacerbation of inequalities between the most vulnerable and the more privileged, because young people from more privileged background were actually had access to better equipment as well as better support from their parents that are more likely to have a higher level of human capital against the less privileged that may have had more problems in terms of support as well as equipment that was available. So this would be maybe a problem for the future and their accumulation of the human capital. So this very briefly to an overview of the possible inequalities that may have been surged as a result of the COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massi. So as you said, not a straightforward picture, different groups and population hit in very different ways, but with some, we could expect some emerging inequalities to come forward. Shana, please. So maybe you can brief us a little bit more in Ireland. Like you bring, this was a very much of a European picture, generalized but still specific. So maybe you could bring it a little bit down to what have we observed in Ireland, please, Shana.
Thank you, and thank you for including me in this discussion. So just to give you a brief background, I'm the director of a think tank, and one of our the focuses we've had over the past 20 years of our existence has been on inequality. So we've been following trends in Ireland for several decades now. What I could say is we are a microcosm of exactly what Massi just talked about at an EU level. Ireland has had the worst market inequality rates in the EU, but it's been compensated. So it's now average. It's been consistently an average country, but it's compensated by cash transfers. So the model of policy that was used to alleviate or mitigate against poverty that was talked about is the same policy that Ireland has had for decades in order to address poverty. But on the other hand, there aren't these kinds of bold initiatives that I'm going to suggest now are necessary to address marginalization in the labor market, because those are long-standing issues. I think what happened with the pandemic is it just exacerbated problems that were already there. And the policy responses now need to deal with the problem itself, not just look at it as a post-pandemic response. So the government in Ireland, and this is not for the moment echoed in the EU, is focused on balancing the books. There's, again, this kind of idea of cash transfer to lower income groups, to the unemployed, to businesses that might be in trouble to try to subsidize wages. But it's not the kind of like, let's understand what are the complex issues that keep people either from participating in the labor market or from not being able to develop a career over time. Could you just go to the next slide, and I'll give an overview of the trends in Ireland. Okay, so this is just the general impact of COVID on unemployment. As you can tell, that young people, if you look at this data, and again, this echoes what was just said, the unemployment rate was 7.1% in the first quarter of 2021. But if you look at the unemployment rate for those 65 to 74 years, and again, a good chunk of this population might be retired, but it's 4.4%. But they're either retired or they're in very senior positions, but it's as high as 25.3% for those who are aged 15 to 19 years. And if you look at a year ago in 2020, if you look a year back, then they also had these differences in rates, but they were much lower. So if you look at the unemployment rate for those who are 15 to 24 years old, it's the youth unemployment rate, and it was 15.6% in the first quarter of 2021, and that's up from 10.5% in the first quarter of 2020. But what Ireland is also, and I'll get to in just a second, it also is high rates of NEET for those of you who are not in education, employment, and training, and I'll show you those statistics. If you could go to the next slide. So it's not just young people, it's also people who are with lower levels of education or lack skills that would make them eligible for better paid jobs. So again, if you're going to look at young people, it's ages 15 to 24. As of May of this year, it's about a 17% unemployment rate. If you look at the people who are who are NEET, this category of NEET, not in education, employment, or training, it was 17.2% in 2020. But that's higher than other small European countries like Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands, and particularly amongst women, which is at about 20%. The reason I'm bringing that figure up, even though it's from 2020, which is not accounting for the bulk of the pandemic, it's because this is the group that needs to be targeted by EU and national policy. Because if you're not developing your skills and you're not in employment, then the odds of you getting into a decent job or getting into the labor market at all are lower. And that's going to be a critical issue going forward with EU and national policy. If you look at the long-term unemployed, which is more than 6 months, it's increased from 1.3% to 1.7% between the first quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021. And that might seem like a really low rate, but it's actually people who've been out of the labor market for not just half a year or a year. It could be that they've never been in the labor market. Ireland has a minority population. They have Roma and travelers. There's a specific Irish traveler population that lives in the UK and in Ireland. Now, this population was particularly affected by the pandemic in terms of health, access to benefits, but also they're already marginalized in the labor market. So just as an example of groups that they may never have been in the labor market, 80% of the Irish travelers are reported to be unemployed. Can you just go to the next slide? If you can think that the rates amongst Roma in other countries like Hungary or Romania are probably going to be exceptionally high as well, particularly post-pandemic. But it's a bit maybe a bit hard to read. But if I were to keep going in the margins of the labor market, and the reason why there needs to be a bold response at an EU level and a national level, because these are long-standing trends. Ireland doesn't do very well with the number of disabled who are in employment. If you look at the 2016 census, 1 in 10 persons below 45 has a disability. There's a recent study by IBEC, which is the business association in Ireland, from this past summer, to say that the rate of employment amongst people with disabilities is half the European average. And the gap between the employment rate of people with and without disabilities is also the second widest in the EU. So if you think about the first people who were let go, it's young people who are in what are called public-facing jobs, in hospitality, fast food, et cetera. But it's also going to be people who are disabled. And I don't know the exact statistics, but that was certainly the case in Ireland, because they're in jobs that would be cut if you're trying to survive as a business. So the second category I have here is migrants. 12% of the population in Ireland is not Irish. There's a large Polish and British population, followed by Lithuania, Romania, and Brazil. Now, a number of these people might work in agriculture, fast food. They might work in care. There's a particularly large population of migrants who are working in the care economy. So they may have kept their jobs, but at high risk to their health. So they would have worked, if you're working in home care or nursing home care, or you're working in frontline health services. This was the opposite with childcare workers, many of whom lost their job or who've not been able to return full time. But I'm going to talk about that in just a second when I conclude. So NESC is an Irish research organization associated with the state. It's migrant families have a lower level of income than Irish families, and so are likely to feel the financial effects of COVID-19 lockdown more strongly. This is not just in terms of income, but also housing conditions. If we're going to go back to the idea of how children were educated at school when it was online, there are anecdotal reports of families sharing the same device. It may have been a phone, it may have been an iPad, or you have two devices, but one's a smartphone and one is a computer. So there hasn't been any good data collection on that. It's still anecdotal. But if you think about the long-term impact, if young children haven't had this kind of education, we have to follow it for the next decade or so to see what the impact was of missing essentially months of school because you didn't have access to the right technology. Now, there was an effort by charities and the government to distribute laptops in Ireland, but I don't know how successful that was. If you could just go to the last slide. So there have been policy responses because the problems are evident. And I haven't mentioned women yet because it's very complex. Yes, women, and again, we don't have enough data, but it's not just women dropping out of the labor market because they were either laid off or they had to because of childcare needs. It's also, as has been the case all over the EU, the incidence of domestic abuse, domestic violence rose considerably. It's either because it was reported or because of the situation where people are at home together. So it's not just they aren't able to go back to work because of childcare. It's also the impact on their physical and mental health and access to financial resources. So I think that is a whole nother issue warranting a whole nother policy response beyond just creating jobs. So very, very briefly, we have the National Development Plan in Ireland, which was revised and published earlier this year. And it's supposed to create tens of thousands of jobs through investment in green infrastructure, which is echoing the Green Deal at an EU level. So the Biden administration plan that's going through Congress. We're going to invest in energy, renewable energy. We're going to invest in creating roads, public transportation, childcare, and this is going to create tens of thousands of good jobs. The question is, of course, how do you get from point A to point B? There's also a pathways to work policy, which is supposed to go through 2025, and that's targeting over 2.5 million people in employment. And it's, again, to address the NEET category. It's to provide, especially young people, training, skills, education to get into a job. And they're particularly targeting the long-term unemployed, which is of particular concern in Ireland. And the budget from 2022 is committed to investing in childcare and mental health because there will be long-term mental health issues. But at the same time, there is this focus on let's balance the budget. We have to be restrained because we don't want to invest. The problem is that then we may have this marginalization of the labor market, which as the labor market heats up is okay for people who are educated, who can compete for good jobs. But in Ireland, as in other economies, there's a segregation between these high-skilled, high-tech in Ireland, or finance jobs in finance, banking, etc., management, and then these low-paid, often low-status jobs like in home care, hospitality, tourism that don't necessarily lead anywhere. And just papering over it with a bit of cash is not going to address the essential segregation in the economy. Now, the people that I've just spoken about, they are in, for large part, the low wage economy, right? So the real policy ambitions have to be how to get those people into jobs, but also how to get them into better jobs with benefits, more security, so that they can see a future trajectory. If not, we're going to have like the issue, I would argue, we're going to have the issues of like the mental health consequence of the pandemic and the gap in education exacerbated over time, creating more segregation in society. And so I think from an EU perspective, it's to pay attention to these trends across countries. And in Ireland, it's to make sure that the country doesn't end up even more unequal than it already was pre-pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shana. So I think that I think with this crisis, Anna Carla, is that we're amazed about how when we look at the impact on the economic impact of the crisis, which was just enormous, and then we looked at the kind of immediate impact on the labor market and how contained it was in the floor, not completely dropping out of the labor market. And the cash transfers, that what Massi was saying, that kind of mitigated the explosion in inequalities that this could have brought about. You can say that to a certain extent the crisis has been managed fairly well. But then, as Shana says, yeah, but there's a lot of underlying things brewing there that were already present before the crisis, right? But that the crisis has maybe brought out and exacerbated to a certain extent, and it's still brewing. So we need to be careful, not just to continue in the trajectory where we are, but actually look broader and maybe not only look at COVID as a challenge, but try to see, does it actually open up a box and opportunities for us to deal with some of these structural issues that were already present before? Please, Carla.
Yes, good morning to everyone who's listening to us, and thank you for inviting me for this talk. And I will certainly concur with you, Maria, with the reading that you take from the previous interventions, because it's very similar to the reading we have in the Commission. I think we have to, in many ways, celebrate the way we have reacted as a continent to the pandemic last year. If we compare this crisis to, for example, the financial crisis in 2011, we see that the reaction has been one of supporting income of families and of workers and self-employed, especially through short time working schemes and at European level through SURE. Then we also had a very significant financial package approved, which gives financial space and breadth to the countries to invest in the areas that need to recover, but also looking forward into the green and digital transition, and that was Next Generation EU. And of course, these elements of response allow us to be today in a better place than what we were, for example, after the financial crisis. But as you have also said, and Shana said, and Massimiliano have said, of course, this is not all, it's not a situation of full roses. It's not, there are underlying weaknesses, there are inequalities that have been exacerbated, and it is important to look at those and continue to work at those. And I think this is also very much the spirit in which the EU leaders came to Porto at the Porto Social Summit last May, is to restate the engagement in working towards fighting inequalities, towards more social inclusion and towards more inclusive labor markets, and showing that the social will be at the center of the recovery and also at the center of the green and digital transformations that we have to go through. So that political mandate that we got from EU leaders in Porto is extremely important as an overall message in pursuing our work as we move forward on the specific issues. And I think when we come to the specific elements that have already been indicated by Massi and by Shana, I would like to refer to a few where the Commission has engaged in concrete action, and we believe can contribute to bringing some structural change in some of the parameters. One of the things that Massi referred to is the inequalities or the clear unbalance in terms of the effect of the pandemic across income groups. And it is clear, has been very clear to all of us, whether in policy making or not, that those that allowed many of us to stay at home safe from COVID were what we now consider essential workers, and for a very long time were probably in a hidden space when we were talking about policy. So that essential work that is now being recognized as essential has kept us safe in our homes. And we are talking here about people who are taking care of our relatives. It is workers that were there in the supermarkets, in the distribution. There's the cleaners. So there is those that have delivered food. So those workers that today we recognize as being performing essential work before the pandemic were not always considered in the policy debate. And this is really an important, I think, lesson or message that comes out of this experience through the pandemic, is that there is a need to revalue work. There is a need to revalue professions that, even if they are hidden or are considered to be low-skilled professions, are essential to our economies and to our societal well-being. And this is one of the reasons why the Commission has put forward a proposal on minimum wage, because what we do see is that many of these workers who have been negatively affected by the crisis are minimum wage earners, and they deserve a decent living out of the hours of work they perform. So our proposal on minimum wage is really a message to the member states to engage in a positive dynamic, to bring decent wages for those who perform essential work and allow them to have a decent living. The other element I wanted to refer that has also been mentioned by Massi and also by Shana is the situation of young people. Obviously, we have seen how the youngest in our societies have been very, very much affected by the interruption or different ways of accessing education. But we also need to think of those who had finished their education and all of a sudden did not have the possibility of entering into the labor market. And we have to also think about those who were in the labor market, but in some form of precarious work and have been the first ones to see their contracts finished. And so having a specific attention to young people is at the core of the political discussion and gives certainly drive to the action of the Commission. And this is the reason why our President Ursula von der Leyen has announced the European Year for Youth in 2022, because there is a strong commitment to put forward actions that support young people in their efforts to have an entry into the labor market, to finish with precariousness of some forms of work, to also give them access to quality education. And because Shana mentioned the need, so those that are not in education, employment and training, I use the opportunity here to refer to a new program that the Commission will be launching, which is ALMA. ALMA is intended to support need, so those not in education, employment or training, in having an experience, a work experience in a different country, to be able to regain a step into the labor market and be able to regain confidence and regain skills. The other element that we are putting forward this year is a council recommendation on individual learning accounts. This initiative is aimed at bringing to the individuals more possibilities for learning. And as it has been mentioned, of course, as we go through the transitions for more climate neutral ways of production, we will see changes in jobs. We will see sectors that slowly will decline, and we will be seeing the emergence of other sectors. And so having the possibility, giving the possibility to people to train and retrain and gain new skills is essential. And this is one of the reasons why the Commission is committed to this concept of individual learning accounts, and we will work with the member states to put this in practice. One of the things that has also been mentioned, and we are all obviously all affected, but as Shana mentioned, particularly, and Massi, particularly affecting women, is the work-life balance, and is the way we have tried to address the pandemic through virtual means, like today, for example, that we are in an online conversation. And obviously, this has raised questions to what is the health and safety in the workplace? What is the workplace, to start with, for many of us? How are people coping with mental health, with the new demands that this type of work brings in the different sectors? And obviously, a particular attention also to this work, this notion of being able to disconnect and have time for a private life, and have clear boundaries between professional and private life. So the Commission has also last year presented, or before the summer, sorry, it looks far away already, a framework on occupational safety and health in the workplace, because obviously some of the challenges that we face now are just a symptom of the big transformations that we are having in the labor market. The fact that the way we work is much more digitalized brings new challenges in the type of diseases the new type of diseases that emerge. As I mentioned, the definition of the workplace, and also the understanding that the way we work brings new dimensions to health. So this new framework that we have presented is also looking at those elements, providing a strategic canvas for countries to work with. And among that, one important element is certainly this idea of a zero level of accidents, or zero tolerance to accidents and deaths in the workplace, because this is probably one of the most still shocking elements in the European way of living, is that there are still many deaths happening in the workplace due to bad working conditions. And so this is something that we have put forward and engaged with the different stakeholders to make sure that at national level measures are being put forward to avoid further deaths in the workplace. Now, as we move along to new initiatives, I would like to refer to two new ones that are in the pipeline. And the first one that has not been truly addressed by my the previous speakers, but I think it's worth mentioning, relates to platform work and the working conditions of those working through platform. Because what we have seen through the crisis was also the resilience of those bringing food to our doors when we would not be able to go shopping, for example. And although this was very present in those moments, so mainly during lockdown, this is something that is now happening for some time, that we see a proliferation of platform work, and we all know the riders and the food those that deliver food. So this is a phenomenon that is growing very, very quickly in the economy. Although in terms of absolute numbers, we cannot still talk about a massive percentage of the labor market. What we see, however, is that, and we saw very clearly through the pandemic, is that the working conditions through which some of these people have to go through are really, really precarious. And so the Commission is engaged in bringing forward a legislative proposal to address that situation, and also consider that when we move towards a more digitalized society, we need to ensure that social standards continue to be preserved and are strengthened through that process of change. Digitalization is something very good. The Commission is a big champion of the digital transformation, but it cannot be a synonymous of precariousness and lower social standards. And this is for us an essential point, and this is one of the reasons why we are engaged in bringing forward a legislative proposal in this area. And the other and final remark that I wanted to make, because the previous speaker spoke about it, so I feel I really have to say something about it, is an initiative on care that we will put forward next year, because as it has been said, care has been at the center of our lives in the last 18 months, and it just shows how much unpaid work is performed in our societies, mainly by women, and how this is very often not valued. And here I would certainly make a reference to what Shana mentioned, also the contribution of migrants in that process, and very often how difficult their position is in performing those tasks, because they are very vulnerable. Their position is extremely vulnerable in the labor market. So hopefully our strategy next year will bring some answers to those questions, certainly putting at the core center of the debate the working conditions in the care economy, and striving to have a sector that is attractive, that is well remunerated, that has good working conditions, because there is also a tremendous job potential in the care economy in the future. I leave it at that, and we can certainly discuss further if there are questions.
Thank you. I mean, we don't have that much time anymore, as far as I can see, but we do have a lot of very different questions coming in from the audience. There was a question from Jack Gibbons, Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and how important the directive on adequate minimum wages is actually going out in terms out of the post-pandemic, in terms of having a more equal and inclusive post-pandemic. And Carla, I think you answered on that one in terms of saying we have observed that many minimum wage workers were actually negatively hit, and so it's very important to boost a little bit the wage setting, the wages around these sectors, moving out of the pandemic. I might go into a question that gets us a little bit back to the young people. We've spoken a lot about the young people. I think that is a little bit of a group that's worrying everybody in terms of education, in terms of the labor market, but also in terms of mental illness. And while we spoke a little bit about the education part of it, we spoke a little bit about the labor market part of it, what about the mental illness, the prevalence of mental illness? Now, that might not be an EU strategy or prerogative, but what are your thoughts about, what are the, what are the priorities in addressing this emerging health crisis for young people? Because also that impacts on their future moving forward. So that's one question. And the second question is I would like to go to one because it is on the disabilities, because Shana, you mentioned disabilities, people with disabilities in your talk, and that the situation in Ireland is not very promising on this. And Fletcher Phelan from the Disability Federation Ireland is asking, how can the EU ensure that post-pandemic period addresses some of these issues with regard to people with disabilities, that they're more likely to be at risk of poverty and have lower employment rates? And how can we ensure that the focus on economic recovery does not stop us from addressing this social justice? So I think I would just put these two questions, so on youth and on people with disabilities. And then I have a more kind of very precise question coming from Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Grund- und Menschenrechten being research, and he's very interested in knowing some more about the firewall introduced by the Irish government, allowing undocumented labour migrants to apply for certain social support measures without having their data forward to the Ministry of Justice. But maybe, Shana, you can get back on a bilateral level on this one too. And with that, I think that we are a little bit out of time. So just, people with disabilities and youth, please. I don't know who wants to come in first.
I can, if you want.
Okay, please, Nancy.
Yes, regarding youth and mental health, actually. But first of all, I wanted to highlight that, yes, the nature of the questions that we are receiving is very broad, actually. And probably this confirms really the complexity of the beast that hit all of us. I mean, the COVID as a crisis due to an exogenous agent as the virus. But regarding mental health, actually, and young people, that's I think that together with the COVID pandemic, there is now around another epidemic, and this is the mental health epidemic. Actually, this was created basically by the fear for the virus, of the uncertainty in the labor market participation, as well as the result of social isolation and loneliness as a result of the various lockdowns. And young people actually has been hit harder by this second part, actually, by the implications of the lockdown measures and so on. I think it's very important to intervene in that, actually, and to address these problems that many young people have. I hear some noise, actually. I don't know it's, but that young people may actually have, because it is essential in order to build their future and to do not bring this scar for the rest of their life, actually, also in terms of the participation of the labor market. I think that first of all, it is important to recognize the problem and then to act, but also to remove the possible shame that always mental health problems bring with them. Actually, we have been all hit by that, and so it is important that the recognition, that the identification, and then to address these problems in order to remove the scar that especially youth can bring for the rest of their life. Say that, then I just wanted to add a limited things that is say, yeah, we are in front of labor market changes, actually, and that will, as Carla said, the change in jobs, the change in sectors. So we don't really know the effect in the labor market, because it will be very probably a very different labor market, the labor market of the future, due to this hybrid new form of work. So it will be difficult then to identify the sectors that will have more work and the need of reskilling of workers. So sorry, I was just connecting with another question as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Carla, you want maybe to come in on the people with disabilities, and Shana maybe as well, and have another question for you, Shana, after that.
Yeah, yes, maybe a point that I wanted to certainly support by Massimiliano. I think on mental health, I think first of all, when we think about mental health, then we think it's a clinical problem, and of course, we need to address it from a medical clinical point of view when there is need, but looking at the reasons why there might be more issues related to mental health is essential, because, for example, the insecurities young people might have around entering in the labor market, it is let's say a source of maybe mental health problem, and it will not be treated from a clinical point of view. So I think addressing mental health from both angles is extremely important. It cannot just be considered a medical or a clinical issue. It is a societal issue that needs answers at the root of the sources of this distress that might exist, and then can be lived differently from an individual point of view. On the people with disabilities, I think, of course, this is what Shana had mentioned. Of course, if the labor markets are booming, you will have a tendency to see those who are more qualified or have less impediments to easily enter in a positive dynamic in the labor market. But there are groups like people with disabilities that by simply the forces of the labor market will not be able to benefit from that positive movement. And then therefore there is a need clearly to have a positive action and support to stimulate employment of people with disabilities, both in terms of providing support measures to them, but also, and I would say even more importantly, having action vis-a-vis employers to in a sense of raising awareness for the talents and the possibilities that and skills that people with disabilities can bring to the workplace, and try to demystify and break those barriers that might exist, that sometimes are stigmas and are prejudice barriers in a way. So in light of this, the Commission has presented a strategy, a European disability strategy until 2030. This was presented in March this year. And one of the things that we have announced is that next year we will make a proposal for a package of measures related to employment, to stimulate employment of people with disabilities. And within that package, we will certainly address messages related to employers, but also work with public employment services, and also work with social services who support directly people with disabilities. So this is in the pipeline for next year.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Carla. Shana, you might want to get in on this, but I have one more question that I think I would direct to you, and this is from Fintan Farrell, independent expert social inclusion. So it's about the adequacy of income support. So it was clearly more recognized through the pandemic. And what you were saying in your talk was basically, but we can't fix all our underlying structural problems with glossing over just by, handing over income support. That was a part of at least what you said, not saying that it shouldn't happen, but, you cannot only do that, basically. But what Fintan is saying is, so we discovered that, this income support has become extremely recognized during the pandemic. Massi also said, it drastically reduced the inequalities that could have occurred. So he's asking, can this transfer into real moves to actually have adequate, accessible, and enabling minimum income schemes all over Europe for everyone? And asking what the Commission, Irish government, social partners, civil society is doing. I would just more ask you, what has this kind of sparked in terms of reflections within Ireland? The PUP was put in, it's higher than the normal income support and so forth. Has this kind of sparked any reflections? And do you think that some of this should continue into the future? Please, Shana.
Thank you. First of all, just with mental health, I think it would be good to recognize that it's a social issue and to destigmatize it. But I think one of the important, both here in Ireland and at EU level, one of the important policy areas would be to look at the role of community organizations. It requires sort of very local support. I think people you trust, people you know. And so any kind of funding stream and any kind of support or knowledge sharing across countries for community organizations, I think would be important in addressing that, especially for young people, because it often works better if it's the people you know who are offering the service, especially with mental health. In terms of, I saw that question. I think Ireland is a specific case within the EU because public services can be so poor, to be really honest. So it's not just income. You also need to be able to use that income to pay for housing, or to pay for, if you're not in social housing, or to pay for health, or to pay if you don't have a medical card, which here in Ireland, I think it's under 30,000 you qualify for a medical card, but you still would end up on a long waiting list to access a health service. So I think Ireland is a particular case. I totally agree with having to rethink adequate income across the EU, and we might have to anyway, because not just in the EU, but also in the US, they're finding people just don't want to take on low-paid work anymore. They don't want to go with sort of a general strike. And it's harder and harder to find people to work in childcare. If you're going to have an initiative in childcare, you have to make it into not just an immediate job, but also something you can see as a lifelong opportunity. And you're not going to get that on minimum wage. It has to be something you can progress and earn more. But in Ireland, without the investment in public services, there's a people who are in Ireland will know it's Sláinte care. Without making primary care universally accessible, there's still going to be this kind of burden of what does your income have to pay for? And so that's why it won't work in the Irish case on its own. You will need better public services and access to affordable housing.
Okay, thank you very much, Shana. I mean, we're already 10 minutes past what we are, but just maybe there's a lot of good questions in here, but I think if I open that box, we need another hour. So I'm just going to ask Ana Carla maybe briefly just to answer Laura Garay-Gomez from Tamarind Intelligence question about platform delivery workers, when the Commission planned to launch a proposal on the topic, and whether the Commission is favorable to promote those workers as registered as employees instead of self-employed. Just a brief response on that one, and then I'll give each of you the opportunity, 1 minute closure, please, and then we'll close down. Please, Anna.
Yes, answering to Laura's question, the initiative is foreseen still this year, so for the end of this year, if everything goes as planned. And obviously, one of the issues we are looking at is indeed the misclassification of the employment status of those that work through platform, because obviously the classification, the employment status is a gateway to access a number of rights that exists for other workers. And in that conversation, obviously, it's necessary to understand whether there is de facto a relationship of employment, or we are really in front of what we call the genuine self-employed. So when de facto there is a relationship of employment, and as the law has been said, the jurisprudence has been telling us at European and national level, then it is necessary to clarify, to bring that employment status to a work status. So this is one of the things we are discussing right now in the Commission, and certainly stay tuned to see our proposal before the end of the year.
Okay, so just before we close down, I would like each of you just to come with one take-home message, like walking out of, in the wake of the crisis, moving into recovery, into a twin transition. What is the policy that we would need in order to manage emerging or structural inequalities in our societies? What would be the thing you think, this one we cannot miss this time? Please, Massi.
Yes, thanks a lot, actually. Well, I think that I think it would be important that the new normal is not like the old normal, but the crisis highlighted what worked and what didn't work, actually, in our society. And in terms of policies, I think that it will be important to rethink social protection systems that we have in our member states. We know with the pandemic that instruments like minimum income that were like evil word before in the debates actually has been implemented broadly by several member states, and I think it's important that to think how we can use these instruments in order to cover all the population with this type of safety nets that can reduce or prevent the fall in very vulnerable situations. And it is also important that harmonize these throughout all the different member states could be probably a step ahead for all Europe.
Okay, thank you. That would spark a lot of comments I could hear. Shana, please. So what is your initiative? You say this one, we have to do it this time, please.
I would echo the safety net, but I would actually intersect it with climate action because we didn't talk about that at all, but it may also exacerbate inequality. I think that the best initiative going forward would be to try to create local jobs, which would address the supply chain issue, help sustain communities and create jobs, particularly in areas where we're talking about the high concentrations of people on low paid work. I think that we can't really miss that because that is one of the futures of addressing climate change as well, is to think locally or think nationally or think within the EU, but be less dependent upon supply chains that cross the world and air traffic, and to create jobs in renewable energy and industries that are the future for a healthy climate.
Okay, thank you very much, Shana. So, Carla, you put up a lot of initiatives. What do you think would, well, that's a very difficult question for you, of course, but what would you personally think is the one that could make a difference, please?
Well, so I'm not going to answer you directly, Maria, because that's indeed a very difficult question. But I would say, and not wanting to repeat what Massimiliano and Shana said, so I'm going for another thing, which is about really to concentrate on decent working conditions, because I think, as we said before, this is a different state of mind that we have today after as we go out of the pandemic crisis compared to when we were out of the financial crisis. So there is a different political and societal dynamic of wanting good jobs and wanting those to be rewarded. And I think this is the chance to make things different for the future. So to find mechanisms to finish precariousness and really revalue work for its true value, not only from an economic point of view, but from a societal point of view. Voila. So that would be my one take.
Okay, thank you very much, Carla. I'd like to thank the audience for all the questions that you've logged. Unfortunately, we were not able to address all of them. We will get back to you. So with these final concluding comments, I'd like to close down this joint event and thank all the panelists for your observations, for engaging also with the questions that came from the audience. And it looks like this is a conversation that we will continue and that we need to continue for quite a while to ensure that some of the lessons that we can actually draw out of this crisis becomes it gives us better, improves and betters the working lives of people and the living and the societal lives of people in the European Union. So thank you very much to Massi, Shana, and Carla, and to the audience for all the questions that you logged. Bye.